She stepped off the train with one bag, a braid over her shoulder, and a child growing beneath her coat, only to watch the man who promised her a new life turn away in silence the moment he saw her belly. By sundown, Clara sat alone on a frozen bench, clutching his letter like a lifeline gone limp, her future unraveling in a town that had already made up its mind. But just when shame seemed inescapable, a quiet man began to appear, one who asked nothing, offered everything, and never once looked away. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The air smelled of dust and pine when Clara stepped down from the train, her boots sinking slightly into the gravel platform. A breeze lifted the hem of her faded blue dress, fluttering it gently against the slight curve of her stomach. The station was small, just one bench, a crooked sign that read Willow Flats, and a man in a black vest and soot-smudged sleeves standing stiff near the edge of the platform. Samuel Green. His eyes found hers in that first instant, and for a moment Clara allowed herself the smallest flicker of hope. He looked just like in the photograph, a strong jaw, dark hair streaked with silver, arms like tree trunks from years of working iron. But then his gaze drifted downward. It paused, froze. She saw it happen, the light behind his eyes dimming as quickly as it had sparked. He didn't offer his hand, didn't speak, just stared. Clara, trying to steady her breath, gave a small smile and stepped forward. "Mr. Green?" His lips parted slightly, then closed again. "You didn't say—" He gestured vaguely toward her stomach, not touching her, not looking her in the eye. "You were showing already." "I told you I was expecting," she answered, gently but with dignity. "In the last letter." "I thought—" He exhaled, voice strained. "I assumed it wouldn't be obvious." There was a silence then, thick and heavy. He turned away, boots crunching across the gravel, and with no goodbye, no parting word, he left her there, alone with her bag and her child-to-be. Clara sat on the lone bench as the wind grew colder. She drew her coat tighter, more to shield herself from the shame than the chill. The folded letter sat in her lap, still tied with the blue ribbon. She stared at it, trying to remember the warmth she'd felt when she first opened it, the promise of a home. The words, "I'm not looking for perfection," echoing now with cruel irony. The platform emptied. Dusk fell slow and steady, and the station lantern flickered to life overhead. Clara didn't cry. She couldn't. Her eyes were dry, her breath shallow, her back straight. Because in that moment, as the quiet wrapped itself around her like a shroud, she understood something painful and permanent. Hope, when it breaks, cuts deeper than betrayal. And yet, even then, she refused to let go of it entirely. The first snow came early that year, blanketing Willow Flats in a quiet that made even the harshest voices seem softer, for a time. But gossip, Clara soon learned, carried well through winter air. It clung to wood smoke, rode on bootsteps across the boardwalk, and lingered in shop front windows. She heard them even when she didn't look up. "That's her, the one Samuel sent away. She came all the way here, belly and all." Clara kept her head down. She wore plain wool skirts and a borrowed shawl, and each morning she tied her hair back in a simple knot that framed her face with tired grace. The small room above the general store was drafty, but it was dry. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Grady, let her earn her keep scrubbing pans, folding linens, sweeping until her hands were raw. Clara never asked for more. She never asked for anything. What she had, she tended to with quiet reverence. Her baby, her dignity, her silence. Every evening, After work was done and the lamps in the store flickered low, she slipped out with her shawl wrapped tight and walked the same path past the bakery, past the schoolhouse, to the low wooden bench by the chapel fence. There, beneath the spindly ash trees and frost-covered gravestones, she sat alone and sang, not loudly, never loudly, but enough that the words warmed the air between her lips and her child. Lullabies her mother once hummed when days were lean. Soft promises she wasn't yet sure she could keep. She had no allies, only watchers, and yet she endured, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Her silence became her armor, her steady gaze her shield. In a town that judged her by what they assumed, she gave them nothing to feed on. Then, one morning, as she hauled a sack of potatoes to the back steps, she found a stack of firewood, cut, split, and neatly arranged by the door. No note, no explanation, just warmth, offered without ceremony. The next day, it appeared again, and the day after that, a pie rested on the windowsill, still warm, steam curling into the cold air like a secret. Then came mittens, handmade, thick and soft, with stitching so careful it must have come from someone who still believed in usefulness over show. She said nothing. She didn't ask. But when the townsfolk passed her in the store and found her humming softly, her hands busy and her eyes no longer cast downward, they noticed something had changed. Not loudly, not proudly, but undeniably. Clara May was still there, still carrying her child, still standing. And now she was no longer entirely alone. The snow was thick that year, soft as sifted flour, falling in slow curtains over the quiet town. It buried fences and windowsills alike, muffling boots on the boardwalk and softening the sharpness of everyday life. For Clara, it was the gentlest winter she'd ever known, not because the cold had spared her, but because the silence no longer felt like solitude. John Booker never asked questions. He never once brought up the day she arrived or the man who turned away. He didn't speak of what her belly made plain. He only tipped his hat when they passed and asked, "You keeping warm?" in that low voice that always seemed to settle something inside her. He never lingered, never pressed, but he was there. Clara, in turn, did not speak much either. But one afternoon, as the wind howled through the alley behind the general store, she set a jar of her best apple preserves on his porch, carefully wrapped in a square of muslin with her name stitched faintly in the corner. A quiet thank you for the firewood, the pie, the gloves, and the unspoken kindness of a man who saw her and did not turn away. 2 weeks later, a small parcel appeared outside her door. Inside, a worn volume of poems, Emily Dickinson, her favorite, and tucked between the pages, a violet pressed long ago, its edges faded but still fragrant with memory. They never spoke of pain, never spoke of the child. But when Clara entered the chapel on Sundays, he stood from his pew to make room beside him. He offered his arm when the path was slick, sat beside her in stillness. And when the preacher spoke of burden and shame and the mercy of grace, John didn't bow his head. He reached out and took her hand, not to make a statement, but because it was simply what he would have done for someone he cared for. He didn't squeeze, he didn't tremble. He just held her hand, steady as stone. And that small gesture, unnoticed by many but unforgettable to Clara, was the moment something inside her mended. The town began to see it too. The whispers grew softer, replaced by nods, by small courtesies. The grocer called her Miss Booker one morning without thinking, and though her cheeks flushed pink, Clara let it stand. Not because she was his wife, but because, in all the ways that mattered, she belonged somewhere again. and with each day that passed, her spirit, battered but never broken, grew stronger beneath the snow. The thaw came slow that year, as if even the land needed time to believe spring was real. Snow receded in ribbons, revealing earth still damp with memory. Buds pushed through frost-bitten branches like cautious hands, and the hills, once hard and white, turned the softest shade of green. In that gentle unfolding, something in Clara shifted too. Her son, just a few weeks old, had a gaze that steadied her, gray-blue like twilight, deep with questions no infant should yet know. He laughed easily, a bright sound that warmed even the coldest corners of the general store. Mrs. Grady stopped scowling when he reached for her apron string. Even the widowed miller, who rarely spoke, once tipped his hat and said, "Strong set of lungs on that boy." The town was changing, not in leaps, but in patient, watchful inches. John never said much. He didn't bring flowers or write love letters. But one Sunday morning, just after the chapel bells had stopped ringing, he took Clara's hand as they walked along the edge of the field where wildflowers had begun to bloom. He paused beneath a dogwood tree, pulled a small silver ring from his pocket, nothing grand, just smooth and simple, and slipped it onto her finger like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly, "but if you'll let me, I'll walk beside you both, all the way." Clara couldn't speak at first. Her throat tightened, her heart too full to form words. But she nodded, once, then again, and the tears that came weren't from sorrow or shame, but from the quiet grace of being chosen for exactly who she was, without explanation or apology. There was no wedding dress, no fanfare. Just the steady rhythm of a life beginning again. At the June picnic, Clara wore a sky-blue dress with hand-stitched cuffs and held her son close against her chest. She sat beside John beneath a willow tree, a plate of cornbread in her lap, and sunlight dancing in her hair. Children ran past with ribbons, neighbors offered pie and praise, and if anyone still whispered, it was only to say, "That man, he saved her." Or more truthfully, they saved each other. Because sometimes the family that heals you isn't born. It's built, not from vows, but from gestures, not from declarations, but from staying. And when John looked at Clara now, it was not to rewrite her past, but to honor it. That kind of love doesn't shout. It simply stands beside you and stays